Hi, as you can see from that little preamble, I recently attended a Lenny KAYE appearance at Topping & Co. Bookshop in Bath, who've recently relocated. Congratulations to them, to all the team there. I don't work for them. I did work for them briefly once for a few weeks, and I've known Sabre, the manager, and Robert, who owns Toppings, for many years, because we once used to work for the same company. So it was a great event. Lenny is not sort of one of my major heroes, but you know, he is an important figure for me, and a great guy. And I want to talk to you a bit about the event itself before I show you some more footage, and also do a review of his book, which is Lightning Strikes: 10 Transformative Moments in Rock and Roll from White Rabbit, which is a rock and roll oriented imprint. This comes under the Orion banner like Golax. They're doing some really interesting stuff, including some fiction, which is really good. So I'll come back to that. It wasn't the sort of event where I felt I could sit in the front row comfortably and hold a camera up and film the whole thing. And I don't think anybody actually did that. Maybe somebody's done it, because it was sort of mostly more mature people who are not used to doing that sort of stuff. And it was like an intimate thing, even though there's about 70 people there, because the space is very, very beautiful. And it just didn't feel right. You know, you want to be in the moment, and you go to gigs and things these days and everybody's filming it, but you want to be in the moment. So if you missed it, well, I'm sorry, but you had to be there, as they say. But you'll see some more later on. It was great to see some people I knew there and talk to people about Lenny and the PATTI Smith group and what have you. But I want to talk about some of the questions which came up, which Lenny talked about several things. There's a formal Q&A and then one open to the audience. And one of the key questions I felt, somebody asked whether he felt whether current music was overproduced and lacked the rawness, and you know, what did he feel was missing. And Lenny, you know, it's a population. He likes all kinds of music, and he was, you know, he's always interested in sound itself and fascinated by that, and that does come across in the book as well. And he said this many times. He did say he missed the emotion in a lot of contemporary music, and in some ways he felt it was quite strange. And he went on to talk about the illusory nature of albums, and he referred to horses and said how he feels that with the PATTI Smith group he made better records, which I would agree with. I personally favour Easter above all of them, though I do love horses. He said that, you know, when you're making a record like Horses, you have no idea you're producing a classic at the time, and if you did, you'd probably take more care. And of course there were clashes between the PATTI Smith group and John Cale, the producer, who is one of my idols. And it was interesting to hear about some of those in detail, and how John made him go out and buy a new guitar because his guitar was always out of tune. And he did say that, you know, he was terrible at tuning a guitar, which is really interesting for somebody who's played for so long and is, you know, is such a great guitar player as he is. So that was interesting. And I think in some ways some of the audience wanted a more conventional punk response for him, and punk came up in the official sort of questions, as it were, from Sabre, who's taking the event. And it was interesting because Lenny talked about how the CBGB scene, all the bands were different, which of course they were, and he said it was more of a spirit and a collective restart. And of course that's what initially drew a lot of us to punk rock, as I call it, as it used to be called, because it was punk rock initially before it was punk. And I always think of punk as being the formula. And he said that, you know, when it sort of influenced the UK, what you basically got was more of a formula. Well, I think that's true to a degree, but you have to remember that the musicians in the UK are mostly younger, so they'd had less time to hone their craft, and that was one of the points of punk, I think, wasn't it? So, you know, there was more sort of sonic similarity between, say, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the X-Ray Specs, the Buzzcocks, but at the same time, the devil's in the detail. I mean, if you look at the Sex Pistols, everybody talks about, and Lenny talks in the book about how the Who, the Small Faces influence, you know, Matlock and Cook and Jones. But to me, you know, it's more the sort of Alice Cooper and Hawkwood influences that come in via Leiden, which are more important in separating them, and the obvious New York Dolls, you know, influences, because, you know, it's Puss in Boots comes up from the New York Dolls album, the second Dolls album, as Liar. The music's exactly the same, you know. So so I think there's a bit more to it. There's the sax of the X-Ray Specs, which probably comes from Roxy Music. And interestingly, the Stranglers, who are often excluded from this, and this drives me nuts. The Stranglers were a punk rock band. At the beginning, when people in Britain started getting interested in punk and punk rock, the Stranglers were included. They were clearly hitting the nail on the head. They toured the UK. They'd been in lots of confrontational situations. And, you know, they had sort of blazed a trail between pub rock. They'd taken maybe from Dr. Feelgood, whose own aggression had fed through into New York, because Clem Burke, I believe, took a copy of the first Feelgood's album back to New York and played it at loft parties of the CBGB scene. So it wasn't entirely all one way. It didn't all come from the States. There was a two-way thing. And, of course, Wilco Johnson from Dr. Feelgood shared a flat with J.J. Bernal. So, you know, there's something there, isn't there? And in his book Strangled, Phil Knight talks about the anti-structural aspects of the Stranglers, how they weren't manufactured in any way in the way that maybe the Pistols and Clash were kind of put together by Svengali figures. The Stranglers weren't. They drifted together, four unlikely individuals. And in that way, they're rather like the Beatles, you know, sort of classic thing. There is a kind of mirroring between the Stranglers and the Beatles. You know, you can see how the members sort of fit. You know, Dave Greenfield, the quiet one, you know, Cornwell, the acerbic sort of songwriting front man, as people somehow think. But of course, he wasn't. In the same way the Beatles, you know, they all sang. They had three singers. So there are some things there. But I've digressed a bit, but it is important because, of course, when the Patti Smith group came to the UK first, their first major gigs, they were supported by the Stranglers, who are mentioned in Lenny's book. So I felt that his sort of casting of the UK scene was somewhat cut and paste. And it's funny enough because in the book, a lot of this is about what he calls scenius, the conflation between scenes and genius, which is important. I'm going to come back to that. But it was a kind of a familiar narrative, and I wanted a more unfamiliar narrative. But, you know, that's punk rock for you and punk, I guess. I asked Lenny a question about his background in science fiction fanzines, because I'm interested in that, because I knew it was there, but it's never referred to very much. And I wanted to know more. And he said that his fanzine, which he published, was called Obelisk, ran for 3 issues. He named Cordwainer Smith, author of the Instrumentality of Mankind series, as being a key influence, which was really interesting. He's a very flaky, strange writer, Cordwainer Smith. And he talked about how people like Greg Shaw, later of Bomp Records, you know, who put the Bomp, the fanzine, he started that. And he was this SF fan before. And Paul Williams, of course, who did a book about Philip K. Dick, how he launched Crawdaddy, and how all these people came out of science fiction fanzines, and how fandom and fanzines are an SF thing first. So I'm keen to make this connection because I think rock and roll is the site. If you had music as a corpus and compared it to literature, if music were literature, then rock and roll would be science fiction. You know, science fiction is rock and roll. So the two things to me are much the same. And I want to talk about that at length another time. So that was interesting because he said it was an interesting question. And I think a lot of people don't know about that. And it was great to hear him talk in detail about that. So I really loved that part. So I was really pleased with that. And he answered lots of other questions about music. And, you know, he's obviously a great guy and he looks amazing. You know, he's sort of in his early 70s. He's very slim and fit. And he's got sort of oozes bonhomie and, you know, great sort of anecdotes and what have you. So if you ever get a chance to sort of go to a signing, hopefully you'll do more books. It'd be great if you did an autobiography because that'd be marvelous. And it was also fantastic to see him go back to his roots in music journalism because of course he did that after doing SF fanzines. And so it was primarily as a writer that he and Patti first connected, and he talked about that as well because somebody raised that question, and that was interesting. So it was a really good event, and and he looked great, and at the end he picked up a guitar, which he then tuned using a guitar tuner, and played a little song that he wrote for World Book Night a few years ago, and he picks really well, and it was lovely. So it's really, really great stuff. So if you ever get the chance to go to a Lenny KAYE event, do. About the book itself, I've been reading it the last couple of days, and here it is, as I say, and got a nice signed copy here, and he's done a little lightning strike in there as well. Hope you can see that. There we go, which I thought was great. And it's quite a big tome, it's about 450 pages, and they've done a lovely job, and my partner was disgusted there were no pictures of Lenny inside. And I said to her, it's not that sort of book, though there is one of him in the back there on the flap, which just isn't sort of good enough. Actually, he's much more handsome than that. And yeah, it is. If you've read a lot of rock and roll books, you won't have a huge amount of surprises in this. The basic idea is that he said that this thing that people say, oh, music comes from music, music is wrong, and I completely agree with him. He says that music often comes out of scenes and a conflation of different cultural ideas coming together, all sorts of things, and he's at pains to sort of talk about that in the book, and I think he's absolutely right. And this is why I do Read English Rock on my channel, because I think music, literature, film, all the arts, they all intersect. They're all the same thing. They're all arts. They're just different mediums, and often people's philosophy comes through them. So that's the whole point. And what he does, he looks at a number of different sort of music scenes, and he pins it down to sort of 10 moments. It's actually 11, but that's typical of a top 10. We all have an 11. Cleveland 1952, Memphis 1954, which is about Elvis. And for me, the period from 54 to 56 is really important. He talked at the event about listening to That's All Right Mama and how rock and roll really begins with Elvis. And I'm a great believer in this as well, because before that it's R&B. But, once a white man gets involved and country and all these things come in, then, unfortunately it sounds, it's a big thing about political correctness in rock and roll circles. You have to continually sort of refer to African music. There's no problem with that, because it's undeniable. But, it's when Elvis comes on board, and, it's that sort of overtamed thing of the white man, that mythology against the mythology of the wildness of the African. It's all mythology. It's more complex than that. Comes together in Elvis. And here it was really about that. New Orleans 1957, Philadelphia 1959. These are the chapters I found most interesting, because I've not read enough, I think, about early rock and roll. I have read things, but not enough. Liverpool 62, about the beat group scene. I'm not really even that sort of fussed on the Beatles or the beat group scene or anything, but it's good to have a lot of gaps filled in. But then it goes to San Francisco 67, Detroit 69, New York City 75, London 1977. And these are things I'm very familiar with. There's things that came out I didn't know. But, anybody who's read a lot of rock and roll will know a lot of this. And then chapter 9 is 2 scenes. Los Angeles 1984, the hair metal scene. So I thought it was a really brave thing to do and to go into, because nobody sort of talks about that seriously. And he doesn't really talk about it seriously, but he talks about it to let you know about the scene. If you've never seen, things like Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, he does teach you about that scene. It's good. And he goes into Norway 1993 and the black metal thing. I mean, the full details of the black metal thing, you're better to read Lords of Chaos, which is a fantastic book, because it works as a music book, a true crime book. It works as a sociological exploration. It works as a history book. So it's so many levels. Superb piece of journalism. I can't say enough. And then he goes on to Seattle 1991 and grunge, which I personally am not too interested in. But he pins those moments down, and he gives you a great sort of overview of senius, as I said, the conflation of when things come together. And he talks about how Eno used that term in election. And I do think there's a lot in it, and I do think those things change rock and roll. But I see rock and roll as an outsider thing. The problem with rock and roll and with cults and scenes and movements is that theoretically everybody involved in those subcultures are outsiders. But when you're in those subcultures, you can find yourself an outsider within them, an outsider within, outside of the society of the outsiders. And that's the real thing, the subjective, the personal, the totally individual. And that's what we're in danger of losing in the world these days, to be outside of society. But when you're an outsider, even from outsiders, that's the true rock and roll spirit. And I think that's what I look for. So, I mean, one of the first things I did with this book was look in the index at sort of bands I like who are, you know, not famous. People like Hawkwind, the Stranglers, you can see where they are mentioned, and they are. And, you know, because they are outsiders within outsiderdom, of course, they don't always play major parts, or they're not perceived as playing major parts in these sort of scenes. But of course, I'll mention the Stranglers once more, I'm afraid. They did play a major part in punk rock, whether people like it or not. John Savage has effectively written them out, and I can understand why. I don't blame him. And, you know, it's an arguable point, it's a thesis. But what concerns me about this kind of rock and roll history is that we can so easily rebel into conformity. We can see rebellion as being one thing. Well, as soon as something becomes established and set in stone, it ceases to be rebellious, except against the corpus of the mainstream. So I think what we need in rock and roll writing is more writing that rebels against the consensus in rock and roll, that says, no, we need to rewrite things, we need to look at things, we need revisionist histories, we need alternative views. Nevertheless, this is a great book, and what makes it great is Lenny's turn of phrase. He writes very poetically, with great style and elan, and he also writes with an immediacy. He puts you in the moment, tells the stories, pulls the connections together. He pulls the wider stuff in. There's some great stuff in here in the San Francisco thing about this tape center, which I didn't know anything about, which was really interesting because he talked in the event about how he loved John Cipollina, or I think the correct pronunciation is Cipollina, according to the guys from Man, from Quicksilver Messenger Service, how he was his favorite guitarist. And he talked about his amplification setup, which I knew about because I'd read about it in Deke Leonard's book Rhinos, Winos and Lunatics, which is a fantastic book. It's out of print now. If you can get it. It's one of the funniest rock and roll books you'd ever read, and one of the best. And I'll talk about that another time. But yeah, it's got great style, you know, and it's great to see him going back to his roots as a writer. So I really hope he moves forward and does an autobiography. He says he still loves science fiction and crime writing and stuff, and you know, and I think one of the reasons why he's such an important figure and why he's stuck with PATTI and why that partnership really works is because he is a literary man as well. He understands the way that culture works. So lightning striking. It's a great Christmas present for anybody who likes rock and roll but needs some gaps filling in. Certainly filled in some gaps for me. So if you can get out there. I'm now going to show you some more scenes of Lenny signing from the event. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out, and I'll be back with more Reading List Rock soon. Bye for now.